Hello and welcome to part 2 of Washington's World Fairs with Miss Jarman. In part 1, we looked at just the history of World's Fairs, what they were, how they started, some important things that happened at them, some important inventions that were introduced at them. And now that we have that background knowledge, we're going to look at the 3 World's Fairs that were hosted in Washington State. As I mentioned, Washington has hosted 3 World's Fairs. The first one was held in 1909, right here in Seattle on the UW campus. And a lot of what you see on the UW campus today was built there in 1909 to structure the World's Fair. Very cool. Now we all know about this one, 1962 Seattle. And then there was also one in 1974 in Spokane, Washington. And my husband remembers going to this one when he was 3 years old. So ask your parents, ask your grandparents. They might remember going to this fair, maybe even this fair. Ask them. Okay, first up, it is 1909 in Seattle, and it is the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition. Take a look at that picture. That is what the UW campus looked like in 1909. And the fountain and the pavilion and some of the buildings were built especially for the World's Fair. And so you can kind of see its footprint. If you've been on the UW campus, you can still see that World's Fair's footprint today. I'd mentioned that these World Fairs were often commemorating big events in American history. And this World's Fair was commemorating the Alaska gold rush that brought all that wealth to Seattle. It was also kind of touting Alaska and the industry and the gold available there. The main exhibitors at this fair were mostly from the United States. States like New York and California came to represent. Individual counties in Washington State came to represent. They were there to show their farming technology and their products and all of that. Japan came to the fair too to exhibit. Now you'll remember from our discrimination lesson that relations between white Seattleites and Japanese American citizens in Seattle were very strained at this time, but there was a very valuable trade relationship between the United States and Japan, based out of Seattle. So everybody kind of had to put their issues aside and honor the Japanese visitors that came to the fair. China did not come to our World's Fair in 1909. I believe they were invited and declined, but the Chinese Americans who were living in Seattle put on a China exhibit themselves. They really felt that this was a time to showcase their culture and to kind of show themselves beyond the stereotypes that existed. So China and Japan were represented at this World's Fair in 1909. Alaska and Hawaii were not states yet, but both of them had been colonized and subdued by Europeans over the centuries, and then annexed by the United States. Annexed means taken without permission of the indigenous people who were living there at the time, the people who had been living there since time immemorial. But as far as the United States understood things, they believed they'd acquired these great new places with these great new resources, and they wanted to show it off. And what better place than the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition? While they're exhibiting the resources from Alaska and Hawaii, the fair is also exhibiting the indigenous people from Alaska and Hawaii and showing their customs and their cultures, but not in a super respectful way. There's definitely an underlying tone that the United States is better and that these indigenous people are just kind of strange and they sure are lucky to be colonized. Nobody comes right out and says that, but that's kind of the tone. But the really awful piece of this was the display of Igorot people from the Philippines. A few years earlier, you'll remember from that map, Spain had ceded the Philippines to the United States in the Spanish-American War. Well, the United States continued fighting with the Filipino people who wanted their independence. So, even though at the time most Filipino people were Catholic, having been colonized by Spain since the 1500s, the United States military brought this group of indigenous people called the Igorot from the Philippines to the United States for the purpose of showing them off as representative of Filipino culture, and in just kind of a really gross way. They called them headhunters. They had them really highlight things about their culture that might scare people, and they toured them around the country. They were at Coney Island, and they were at the Seattle World's Fair in 1909. Not awesome. The scholar Robin K. Wright says that these human displays, it was part of the imperial colonization of the world. And by putting on display the so-called primitive cultures from these exotic places, then the country could show why their colonization was beneficial to the world. So there that is. And then in the picture you can see there's the Igorot folks are putting on a show for the people at the fair, and everybody's just gathered around to watch. So there that is. So that's the end of part 2. There are some questions for you to answer, and if you want to, there's a documentary about this World's Fair also available if you scroll down, and if you're interested or you want to learn more, go ahead and watch it. Maybe invite somebody at home to watch it with you. And I will see you in part 3.